Welcome to Wednesday Night Online Bible Study on our Facebook group at First Baptist Church of Macomb for June 30th, 2021. The title tonight from Eyewitness Bible Study is A Kingdom Divided. We'll hear from King Jeroboam and King Rehoboam. And I'll let them, or at least the actors presenting them, present that to you. This is the part of the history of the Kingdom of Israel that we kind of lose track on. And I want to try to summarize this very quickly, just to make sure we're all on the same page and know where we're going with this direction. First things first, we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 11. And I'm just going to start at verse 9 just to remind us where we are in the history. And then after the video, I'm going to have us go to 2 Chronicles chapter 10, so just be aware of that. 1 Kings chapter 11, starting at verse 9. This is the familiar story that we know about King Solomon was so wise, but he turned away. And 2 weeks ago in this session, we talked about all the different ways that he turned away and all the things that changed the culture, and he did. But 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude and you have not kept my command and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son." Verse 13. "Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but I will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and one for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." That's the setup. Because Solomon's not listened, it's been predicted that the kingdom will be divided. This is where we start to lose track and we start to read the Old Testament, and because it's not in clear chronological order, we get confused who Israel is and then mix and match. But just these are things just to remind you of. The southern kingdom, which I'll let the drama present to you what that ends up being, are made up of the two tribes of Israel, Judah and the tiny tribe of Benjamin. These became known as the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Now, when you're reading the Old Testament, there are some times where these are referred to as Israel. Sometimes all 12 tribes are referred to as Israel, or the other 10 tribes are referred to as. It is very confusing. There's a reason you lose track. You really have to back up and make sure you know who's talking, and maybe consult your Bible dictionary to help you with that. The first king of the nation of Judah was Rehoboam. Rehoboam, as you will hear about, is one of Solomon's sons. One of the most important assets of the southern kingdom was Jerusalem, including the temple located there. The kings of the southern kingdom will be descendants of King David. It is the southern kingdom that will eventually go into exile with Babylon and return from there. The northern nation, the other 10 tribes when this split happens, they became known as the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, which could be important later. If that sounds really confusing, this is why I keep mentioning it. The capital there was mostly the city of Samaria, and the first king was Jeroboam, which we'll hear about in this very. Since the temple was located in the southern kingdom, King Jeroboam set up alternate worship locations and worship methods because he didn't want people going to the southern kingdom. He wanted them to stay in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom was eventually destroyed by the Assyrians around 722 BC. So this is well before the southern kingdom was taken away. And its people are scattered all over, and they're known as, some people call them the lost tribes of Israel. The two kingdoms basically self-destruct, and they waste their resources and they fight amongst each other simply because people listened to bad advice. A few details just before we get into the video presentation. Jeroboam is not a descendant of Solomon. He's not of the Davidic line per se. He was a really hard worker. You can read about that in 1 Kings 11. He was a really hard worker who served Solomon well and got the people organized, and he found a way to keep the people's morale up, help them to feel supportive, to be an excellent leader in the midst of Solomon treating them like slaves, just so his wives could have wonderful things. And if you've forgotten about that, go back 2 weeks ago for this session. There's going to be a reference to Solomon living 40 years, which is going to sound a little suspicious because David lives 40 years, and it starts to sound like, we should have known that people would die at a certain time. Just remember, from historical methods of the day, anything near 40 days, 40 years, is close enough. If it was 38 and a half, that's 40. If it was 42, that's 40. They're not concerned with being exceptionally rigid on the date. So I just want to mention that from a biblical study standpoint. You heard me read that Jeroboam created other places of worship in Samaria. This is the context in John 4 where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman, and the Samaritan woman tries to distract him and says, well, we believe you worship in this place, and you believe this place, and where should we worship God? And these are the famous, we worship God in spirit and in truth. This comes from this historical event. This is why the group started fighting. Well, we worship in the right place. No, you worship in the right place. No, so much confusion was just based on where people worshiped. And before we make fun of them, we do the same thing with, well, I'm a Baptist, and I'm a Methodist, and I believe this, and I believe that. Sometimes we get caught up in things that maybe we shouldn't do. I do want you, before I come to the punchline of this Bible study at the end, and the foolish things we say, and teach you about a cultural phenomenon that's not the same today, this is about where do you get your advice from. It's easy to say, I get my advice from God. But one of the things we learn when we experience God and we try to figure out where we fit into God's kingdom and where we determine God's will, we do this by listening to the right advice from the right people. And that's hard because we often want to hear the advice we already want because we've already decided what we want to do, and we don't listen to others. So just so it's very important in this context, I will come back and read a small portion of 2 Chronicles chapter 10. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rehoboam, and I'll be back in a minute.
I was the fourth king of Israel, for a few days anyway. I don't want to sound like a whiner, but from birth, I never really had a chance. My father was King Solomon. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. There's no record of how many children he fathered. But there was no big argument who would succeed him upon his death. It was me.
The wise Solomon was followed by his foolish son, Rehoboam. His choices led to the division of the kingdom into two parts. The southern part consisted of 2 tribes and was led by Rehoboam. The northern part consisted of the remaining 10 tribes and was led by Solomon's enemy, Jeroboam.
My mother was of the royal family of another country, as were most of King Solomon's other wives. I grew up in a lavish palace and was spoiled as anybody could be. Like a lot of rich kids, I attracted a group of friends that were neither mature or wise. We just want to have a good time. My father didn't have any time for me. In fact, I barely knew him. He certainly didn't take the time to train me up in the way I should go, or pass on any special wisdom to me. One thing he did give me was the inclination to marry many women. I had 18 wives, 60 concubines that gave me 28 sons, 60 daughters, which was a high estrogen house. After reigning over Israel for 40 years, my father died. I should have been a little more apprehensive the year before he died because his father David had reigned for about 40 years, as did his predecessor Saul. After a lavish burial, I succeeded Solomon as king. The who's who of Israel gathered in Shechem to crown me king, and I'm thinking it's going to be this simple coronation. Boy, was I wrong. Surprise of my life. Enter this rough-looking man, traveled For days, by the look of him, and the road had not been kind. I inquired about him. I found out that he is none other than the enemy of my father, Jeroboam, who had fled to Egypt. I couldn't quite remember what caused him to flee, and nobody seemed eager to tell me, so I let it go. I stood in front of the people, expecting to be crowned king by an enthusiastic crowd. I got no such thing. Instead, Jeroboam and the people asked me for their burden to be lightened from the harsh labor and heavy obligations my father had put on them. They said if I did so, they would serve me. They didn't say what they would do if I didn't. Well, I stood in shock. I didn't know what to say, so I told them that I would give them my answer in 3 days. So a day of feasting became a day of panic, and I turned to the elders who served my father, and I asked for their advice. They replied that I should serve the people by lightening their burden, and that they would be my lifelong servants if I did so. I didn't like their answer. I didn't want to reduce my lifestyle or stop the building projects, so I rejected them and their advice. I turned to my friends and asked for their advice. Why I did so, it's still a mystery to me. My friends have never made a good decision in their lives. They were only interested in continuing their lavish lifestyles like me. They insisted that I reject the people's request and threatened to make their burdens even heavier. I didn't want to look weak in front of my friends, so I took their advice. And after 3 days, I delivered my verdict. I told the people that I was going to make their burden heavier, not lighter. It never dawned on me that I was only king because they consented for me to be king. So the entire country of Israel listened, and then a huge majority declared that they no longer considered me their king. They packed up and they went home. And in an instant, I was the acknowledged king of only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. But on my way back to Jerusalem, I determined to regain my father's entire kingdom. I didn't bother to ask God what I should do, because he already decreed that this split would happen. But I had all the authority I needed to declare war. I gathered all the young men from Judah and Benjamin to go to war and regain my kingdom. One man changed my mind. Shemaiah spoke to me and my people with the authority of the Lord. He said that we shouldn't fight against our brothers and that we should go home because God had decreed the split of the kingdom. So it was official. And I was only king of the tiny southern kingdom consisting of the lands of Judah and Benjamin, including the city of Jerusalem, also referred to as the kingdom of Judah. Rehoboam, king of Judah, doesn't have the same ring to it as king of Israel.
Many years before Solomon died, the prophet Ahijah was sent by God to promise me a kingdom consisting of 10 tribes of Israel. I had complete trust in that promise. I patiently bided my time in Egypt, where I'd fled to escape Solomon's threats. I heard rumors that Solomon was dying, so I returned to Israel and prepared to claim the kingdom God had promised me. My old friends and supporters were thrilled that I was back. When Solomon died, I was ready to claim the kingdom God had promised me. I remember with pleasure the look on Rehoboam's face when the people rebelled. They weren't about to follow him. They could clearly see that he was foolish, and he was too foolish to recognize that. He went absolutely crazy when he found they had voluntarily crowned me as the king of the new northern kingdom, also known as the kingdom of Samaria. What I recognized, but Rehoboam did not, was that Israel had only been unified for decades, several decades, but still, that's not very long. Their natural inclination was not to be a unified nation. Rehoboam gave them a reason to rebel, and they took it. Unfortunately, it was only a short time before I, too, neglected to follow God. I paid no attention to the fact that God said I, along with my line of descendants, would lose the kingdom if I did not obey him. I feared losing the loyalty of my subjects. What would happen if they returned to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple? I would lose them. My solution was simple. I decided to make it easier for my subjects to worship in my kingdom and go all the way to Jerusalem. People are driven by convenience and ease. True today, but true then. I built 2 golden calves and placed them in cities much closer than Jerusalem for many of my subjects. I took many of God's requirements and changed them for my own purposes. I built many places to worship, appointed non-Levites as priests, promoted worship of false gods, and did many other detestable things. They quickly chose to follow my ways. I made it easier and cheaper for the people to worship my way than God's way. A man of God came to warn me to change my ways. I kept appointing priests and leading my people to worship false gods, sowing the seeds for my destruction. I ruled over the northern kingdom for 22 years, but watched the male heirs of my family die, one after the other. So now the question, good king or bad king? I was a horrible king because I led the people even deeper into idolatry.
The more I understood my new situation, the more furious I got. The northern kingdom of Jeroboam was not much bigger in size than the southern kingdom, but that is where the similarities ended. The northern kingdom had better farming land than we did. It controlled the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, plus it had control of the countries of Aram, Ammon, and Moab that King David conquered. The vast amount of tribute from these countries would support the northern kingdom for many years. The northern kingdom would also control the northern portion of Philistia, so it would control a large part of the coastal plain and ports along the sea. This also meant that the northern kingdom would control a large part of the lucrative Via Maris trade route. My kingdom, the southern kingdom, was full of desert, hills, rocks. I owned wilderness and the Dead Sea. My land was far inferior to that of the northern kingdom. I did control the vassal nations of Edom, but King David had devastated that country so badly that it was not capable of giving me much tribute. I did control the southern part of Philistia, so I did own part of the coastal plain and some seaports. If it had not been for this area, my people would have suffered greatly. What I misjudged was the countries of Aram, Ammon, Moab, and Edom. As both the northern and southern kingdom declined in power, these countries would find it useful to rebel and become our enemies. The tributes that flowed into our coffers would soon hemorrhage into a devastating military defense cost. I did control Jerusalem with its fabulous temple full of wealth. That control was a mixed blessing, however. I felt like I could live off the wealth of the temple for decades. But the worship of God was a huge distraction to my people. I wanted them to worship Baal and other false gods. Like so many other things, I vastly misjudged the situation concerning the temple. I was 41 years old when I began to reign over the southern kingdom, and I stayed in power for 17 years. I surpassed my rival Jeroboam into leading my people into worshiping idols. We were more pagan than all the pagans who lived in Israel before Joshua drove them out. My 5th year in power, Pharaoh of Egypt victoriously attacked Jerusalem. God allowed it to happen. Pharaoh carried off all of the treasure of the temple and my palace. It's hard to even imagine the amount of wealth that was taken. My power was diminished. I was now a king in name only. Throughout my reign, my kingdom continually fought against Jeroboam and the northern kingdom. By doing so, we were disobedient to God. We weakened each other without benefit to anyone. Good king or bad king? Like Jeroboam, I was a horrible king. I led my people so deep into idolatry that they could never fully recover. Jeroboam and I set the stage for all the future kings and prophets of Israel. Battleground were the hearts of the people, and we had turned their hearts away from God. In his desire for his people to return to him, God disciplined his people in various ways, including using our country's enemies. But his discipline didn't provide a long-term change for their hearts. In less than 20 years after Solomon's death, Israel was split into two kingdoms. Both kingdoms had been decimated of wealth and people, and both kingdoms were steeped in idolatry. What a swift and incredible decline from Israel's golden age. And I was the leading cause. Bad king, indeed.
The book of Kings, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and the books of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles have different objectives and different purposes. The language is a little more respectful in the book of Kings and those kind of things. We're going to read from Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 10. And this is in the section where Rehoboam thinks he gets to be king because it was stated he was going to be king when Solomon died. Solomon dies, he becomes king, and he expects everything to be easy. And all of a sudden he gets challenged with, your father treated us like a slave. We have been worked to our bones. Are you going to treat us this way? As the video mentions, these people were ripe for rebellion. And pushing them harder was going to be a huge mistake. The elders who had worked with Solomon and seen what Solomon did tell Rehoboam, you need to lighten the load. Now, lightening the load means that Rehoboam's not going to have as much wealth and not going to have as much ease and not going to have as much comfort, and he doesn't really like that. So Rehoboam, like many of us do, consulted with his friends. And we'll start actually at verse 8 of 2 Chronicles chapter 10. It reads, but Rehoboam rejected the advice that the elders gave him and consulted the young men he had grown up with and were serving him. He asked them, what is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? Verse 10, and there's so much here that we miss in casual reading. The young men who had grown up with him replied, tell the people I've said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Now there's a lot of imagery here, but I want us just to get the imagery for a second, and it's going to be incredibly culturally insensitive, but important. Those of us who live in the West in the 21st century, a vast majority of us do not have a problem with food. Now, there are children who go to bed hungry. There are families that struggle with this. I get all that. But as a general rule, we're going to find some food that day. In that time period, food was not easy to come by. Food was a lot of work. And you might get one average meal per day. There was, how do I say this delicately? There was not a problem with obesity in Solomon's time, unless you were wealthy. Solomon was wealthy beyond wealthy, beyond wealthy, beyond wealthy. And I'm putting some things together, but just go with me for a second. It's important for this context of when Rehoboam says, my little finger is stronger than my father's waist. As odd as it seems to you based on our image of beauty and attractiveness today, someone who was large was seen to be desirable because they obviously had resources. Solomon, as best we can tell, in that culture weighed about 300 pounds. And I don't mean 300 pounds in our current context, which is probably too much for someone to weigh, but it's not incredibly unrealistic that someone might weigh that. He weighed 300 pounds when the average person might weigh, and I'm just kind of making these numbers up so you find some other source, I think that's great, might weigh 140 or 130 or 120. He was large. His waist was very, very big. And Rehoboam says, my little tiny finger is stronger and more force than my father's waist. He is using an image that everyone would have gotten. And then he says, he used whips on you, I'll use scorpions on you. I'm not going to make it lighter for you. I'm going to make it harder. Now we know what happens, and we can get into what was predicted and how it was, but my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. It means I am so powerful and so amazing. You cannot resist me. Now we know what happens, and the narrative gives you what happens, but this comes down to the simple fact. We as followers of Jesus need to listen to the people around us because somebody knows what you should be doing. At some point, when the lectionary or something else gets around to this, I'll preach on this text, and some title, something like somebody knows the best for you, or who knows, or those kind of things. There is somebody out there who can look at your life, and there may be more than a few, and can see what you should be doing. You just have to be willing to listen. Set aside our pride, set aside all our issues, and just listen. Rehoboam didn't listen. I'm not trying to question prophecies and all these things happen, but what if Rehoboam had listened? What if Jeroboam had listened to God? This whole situation could have turned out differently. What thing in your future could be different if you listened to someone who knows? Now, in fairness, we use this illustration a lot as ministers, and I'm sure I will use it in the future, of sometimes that's your spouse. Sometimes that's your parents. Sometimes that's your kids. Sometimes it's the person at work. Somebody knows what's best for you because it's easier for them to see. Because they're close enough to see it, but not so tied up into it they can't understand. The narrative of Rehoboam and Jeroboam and Solomon is you need to listen to the godly advice around you and not ignore it thinking you know everything. What would life be like if we could do that? Let me close in prayer. And I'm not sure what's happening next week. We may be on a different schedule, but we're kind of going to enter into the world of the prophets Elijah and Elisha in upcoming weeks. But we may be on a different schedule, so we'll kind of update that on our Facebook page and go from there. Let me pray for us, though. Holy God, this is so hard for us. We want to do it ourselves. We want to take care of ourselves, and then when we screw it up, we want you to fix it. Help us to listen to you the first time and listen to the people you put into our lives the first time, the second time, the third time, all the times they told us what to do and we didn't listen. Help us to trust in you and to listen to you because you are the Almighty. You are the All-Powerful. And maybe if we listen to the people who know, we could actually listen to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. Hopefully this was helpful, and we will see you the next time.